Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to NASM Live. My name is Prentiss Rhodes, and I am here with my weekly co-hosts, Wendy Batts and Marty Miller, our regional master instructors and otherwise otherworldly talented people. And today we are going to continue our discussion regarding CES, the Corrective Exercise Specialization. And as many of you know, and if you don't know, I'm going to repeat it anyway. CES is a program of finding or creating targeted flexibility and strength exercises. And the way you do that is you assess, you find an impairment, and you develop a program to work with that impairment. And so that's the foundation of the program. And what we're going to do today is dive a little bit deeper into the assessment process and why we do things the way we do. Because if you aren't assessing your clients, your athletes, to quote one of our regional master instructors, you are just guessing. So we want to go through the assessment process and give you the tools to take your client from end to end, from assessment to programming. So why don't we go ahead and get started? Wendy, so let's talk a little bit about the assessment process, what we're looking for. I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions right away. Where did this come from? Because traditionally, personal trainers, strength trainers, we tested the bench press. We tested, I kind of remember my dad as a kid. He's testing percentages of 1 rep maxes as he's training his athletes. So where did this assessment process come from, and why is it important that we use it now in a training environment?
Well, I mean, as you said, even in Marty's quote, I mean, the thing is the whole purpose of us doing an assessment is to find out where the movement imbalances are, how are they moving when they're standing there? How are they moving when they're just doing some basic transitional movements? And then also, how are they moving when we speed them up? And if we notice that there's a compensation or something isn't actually moving.
Marty, can you go ahead and pick up where Wendy left off?
Wendy's back.
Or is Wendy back? It looks like Wendy's back. Yes, you are back.
Oh, so I didn't even know I was lost. Sorry. Yeah. Oh my goodness. I'm not sure what part got cut off, but basically we want to do different types of assessments because there's always different scenarios. Sure. So we are standing, we are moving at speed. We want to see if there are some imbalances. If so, we want to make note of that. So therefore we can design specific programs to help either fix any kind of imbalances that we may see. We want to try to enhance any kind of ideal movement because, again, as we've said multiple times, in order to, when you start moving better, you're going to perform better. And no matter what type of client you are, you're always an athlete inside. So it doesn't matter if you're, a sedentary person that's never worked out before or you're a high-end athlete. And an assessment process truly gives the trainer the foundation and starting point to design a specific individualized program to get a client to any goal, regardless of what that may be.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the athlete because sometimes we identify ourselves, and at least that's me and my ego, as not needing that. It's a waste of time. I should just be able to go in and exercise without any thought to my movement quality. And corrective exercise is definitely something that should be used for all levels of performance. So I'm glad that you brought that up. So now let's dive a little bit deeper into the types of assessments that we have in the CES course. And we're going to move, we have 4 types that we work with, working with static assessments, transitional assessments, that would be your traditional, your overhead squat, single leg squat, modified overhead squat, dynamic assessments, and isolated mobility tests. So, Wendy, let's start with you again. Why do we need the static assessment? What does that tell us?
Well, static posture assessment is exactly as it sounds. I mean, you're evaluating a client's structure and alignment while they're not moving. So static posture is considered the base for movement, and an individual static posture provides the first clues toward.
So
can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Oh my goodness, I don't know what's happening right now. So, so I don't even know where I cut off, but I mean, basically it's a comprehensive understanding of an overall person's mobility and their neuromuscular control and capabilities. So static posture usually influences the transitional and dynamic movement patterns that we'll talk about. So a static postural assessment provides a great starting point in helping us determine.
It may help us determine. Marty, why don't you go ahead and pick that up?
So, where Wendy's heading with it is when you watch someone's static posture, it's going to give you clues to how they're going to move. When I was talking with my clients, I'd be like, oh, can you stand with your feet straight for a minute? Or I'd straighten them out. And then within a few seconds, they would naturally fall back into their norms and their static posture.
Sure.
I know that my left shoulder, I'm lacking some internal rotation I'm working on. I know that when I'm standing, my left shoulder is a little more internally rotated. So you can pick up on these resting norms from people, and then that is going to give you a better understanding where they're more likely to go. We don't make assumptions, but it's a good indication of what's going to happen as they start moving.
And regarding static posture, what other, and this is good for everyone listening to know, so what other clues do you get? What would your activities of daily living tell you about what you may see in static posture? What would your clients' clothes, and we're talking in a completely professional way, what would do you ever look at the wear patterns of their clothing, their shoes, for example, to get some ideas about their movement quality? And it looks like Wendy's frozen again, so Marty, it's just the two of us today, man.
No worries whatsoever. So everything's going to give you a clue. It just depends on, what I always say is your eye's only trained to see what it's been trained to see. So, we want you to start looking at everything. I watch people as they walk in towards me for their first meeting with me, right? Because once they know I'm starting to assess, they may try to change things or however I'll watch them, walk away from me, things like that, because all of that will give me clues. Again, you don't have to try to digest everything if you're new to this. That's why we start with the overhead squat assessment. That'll tell you an absolute ton. And I was on the coffee talk this morning, and one of the things that came up was, reassessments. And every single set of every single rep is an assessment, because now I'm going to see what happens. And we're going to get to the transitional type of assessments. But the point is that, what happens when you change body positions? What happens when you add fatigue? You're going to see patterns. So, take small bite-sized chunks. Start with the overhead squat assessment if that's what you're starting to learn. But understand that continue to use your eye the same way you did in the structured assessment, whether they're standing in a static position, whether they're starting to move or move quickly, because now you're just reinforcing that as you learn to always be looking at movement compensations. But then also I always revert back to what's causing it, what's allowing it. And that's, I think, the best way to learn this material is just always filter through the movement compensations. What am I seeing? What's pulling it that way? What's allowing it to go to that way? And then that gets you back to your programming.
And to add to what Marty just said, again, that's why the subjective information is so important, because if you can also find out what the client is doing for a living, it can tell you a lot about maybe how they're sitting. So, let's say you have
So let's say you do have
today.
Yeah,
I'm so
the internet spirits aren't with us. We apologize, everyone out there listening, but given our current circumstances, there are just some things that are out of our control. So bear with us. We're committed to giving you a good show today, and we all have some answers to give you. So don't worry about it.
Am I back or no?
You are back.
Well, what I was trying to get at is, and hopefully I can finish this sentence without losing y'all. But if you have a client that is, wearing a business suit, and let's say she's a female and she's wearing a skirt, she'll probably be crossing her legs throughout the day. She may be wearing high heels throughout the day. Same thing with a guy that has to wear a business suit. He may be in high heels because he's wearing a dress shoe. So all of that information is important because, again, that will probably carry over into what you're going to see, statically, meaning that if their calves are in a shortened position all day, when they're standing, their feet will probably go out.
Yeah, if their calves are tight, where she was going is that their feet may go out, and if we're talking about regional interdependence, one movement segment is dependent on what's going on above and below the joint. So you may see impairments in and around where you notice that what's driving that initial impairment. And I think Wendy was talking about shoes, for example.
Exactly.
So if those feet turn out, you may see some movement in the hips, the lumbar spine, and so on to help deal with that impairment. Yep. So, Marty, let me ask you this question, and this is something that I try to share with everyone. So, when does the assessment process start for you? And now that you're back, Wendy, you can answer this one as well. When does the assessment process? When does the assessment process start? Is it after you've taken your history and you have your clipboard there and you're walking around? When does that process begin for you?
Immediately. And sometimes it's when I'm on the phone with them. If this is somebody who called in that I haven't met before and they, want to come in, I might ask, a couple questions. So I'm already starting to formulate, have they worked out before? Are they coming from work? Is it going to be a high stress situation with traffic and all these things? Everything that I can, digest is information to how this client's coming in or what I need to put into their program at some point. I don't need to dump it all in the first day. But, it comes down to going back to the common thing we talk about with somebody's shoes is they can come in twice a week. I could do all the assessment I want. I could identify their issue. If I don't ever address that they're wearing elevated heels, male or female, am I ever going to make a change in that, right? So, it comes down to where, if they have to wear those type of shoes, I get them up and I teach them corrective exercise at work where they can stretch or some type of strategy, because I know that, 2 to 3 sessions a week, if I don't adjust what caused that bad movement, then I might make some improvement, but I may not get them where I want to be. So the assessment process is as soon as I can get it going, and then all the way throughout every single conversation, every single movement that my client is doing.
Outstanding. So now that we've gone through static assessment and what that entails, Marty, let's talk about what's going on in the transitional assessments.
So once you start adding movement, and movement can be a lot of different things. We'll go with the overhead squat assessment because it's a standard of what we do, and it's such an important assessment. Is as you start adding that, things are going to change. Generally speaking, it's only going to get worse than the static, because now you're asking them to load the muscles, start to recruit multiple muscles at the same time as they go through this multi-joint movement of a squat. There's obviously other transitional assessments, single leg squat and things like that. But if you see their feet turn out while they're standing, expect it to get worse. If you see them with rounded shoulders, forward head, expect it to get worse because gravity's starting to play a bigger role now. So that's why it's so important, because, Prentiss, you'd mentioned the bench press. Not that that's a bad assessment. It's just probably not the most important assessment initially, right? Because, if we look at our model, stability comes before strength. So the other thing about is, my assessments, if I'm, Dr. Mike Clark taught me this, if you're going to do assessment, you better be able to do something with the results. So why would I do a strength assessment if I'm haven't even focused on their movement yet? There'll be a time and a place for the strength assessment. So same thing with anything we do. We're going to add movement. We're going to see if things get worse. And when I say worse, not that they're going to not be able to exercise. It's just I need to get more information on how to fix this movement strategy so I can get them to their end goal. So that's the only reason we start static and move from there.
So let me ask you another question, a couple more questions actually about transitional assessments. So why do we set it up? Why do we set our overhead squat up the way we do?
Yeah. Uniformity, because let's say you and I, Prentiss, or Wendy, we all work in the same spot and I'm out of town and you're going to reassess the client. We got to have a standardization. That's through all of any assessments, right? Whether it's our kids going through first grade, second grade, third grade, there's standardization so we can compare to a known norm. So that's why we set people up. Now, we don't overcoach it because, one, we don't want to make people feel, oh my goodness, I'm doing something wrong. No, it's not a negative. It's just start with your feet straight. And I've done this before where I show them physically how to straighten their feet. And as I go to the next body part, I see them start to creep their feet out. I don't go back to it because at that point, their central nervous system is telling me, hey, this doesn't feel comfortable. But I at least give the person one chance to start in that norm, because what they think is straight or not, I at least got to give them an idea, visual, see if they can do it once. So that way I can see if they can keep that position. So if we don't have a standardization, it's hard for us as professionals to compare results as well as to truly know, is it a false positive or not? Or is it, what did we get from that assessment?
Okay, that's outstanding. And if you don't mind, I have a couple more questions for you. And this is a frequently asked question, so I think it bears repeating again. Can you differentiate for us the difference between the squat as a sport exercise, i.e. the athlete who allows a little bit of turnout and they can squat, can we say ATG on the air if I just use the abbreviation? But they can squat, what that means is they can squat really low with a slight turnout of the feet. So why do we do the squat? Why do we assess the squat in the manner that we do?
Sure. So going back to my background is I want to be around athletes. So the best way for me to do it, since at some point my career was going to end, in college, was to be an athletic trainer, which means I got to study sports injuries. And they never taught us if your athletes get injured, it's when they get injured. Now I'm talking about orthopedics. Obviously, participating sports is great for us on a lot of ways, especially cardiovascular, et cetera. But orthopedically, and I've asked this in my seminars, and Wendy's seen me do it. Name me a sport that's good for me orthopedically. Doesn't exist. And I hit, swimming. Nope. Swimmers have horrible necks, horrible shoulder, lat tightness, knee problems. So even swimmers who are in a non-weight bearing position in the water still have overuse injuries. So let's even eliminate the collisions, right? Let's even take that massive category out of there. The movements that we do in sport are not biomechanically sound. Now, you'll get a coach on occasion who says, I want this form of technique and this is perfect. Okay, for the sport, whether I'm throwing a baseball, whether I'm hitting a golf ball, whether we're throwing a kick in martial arts, there is ideal sports movements. But those coaches didn't probably study the biomechanics like we did. And they're not worried about the structural stress on the body to get in those positions. They're worried about ideal sport performance. And again, going back to standardizations, when you talk about the sport of lifting weights, squatting, that was a sport I actually competed in, was powerlifting. They were worried about, could you get your hips, your butt below parallel? Because if not, maybe if I didn't squat deep enough, how could they say that I won the competition if I didn't have to go to a standard depth? They could care less how I got down. They could care less how I got up. I could arch my back. I could put my neck in any position I wanted. My knees could cave in as I went up or went down. Didn't matter. Ideal squat form by a strength coach is going to say, did you get your hips below? Now, biomechanically, there's some advantages when you turn your feet out. It doesn't mean that there's not more stress added to the kinetic chain. It widens your base of support, and it takes out the necessary range of motion of the foot and ankle, which is a huge restriction in most people to get deep. So this is where we got to measure. Are you doing the sport of fitness, or are you doing fitness to stay healthy? If you're doing the sport of, fitness to stay healthy and not a sport, we're going to limit your range of motion until you've earned it. And at some point, you're still going to have a range of motion where you have to change your kinetic chain checkpoints even an ideal. So I know that was a long-winded answer, but the key thing is, in a sport, you're going to do whatever you can to accomplish the end goal according to the rules of the sport. In fitness, we want to keep you healthy and keep you biomechanically sound. But we know if we keep you biomechanically sound, you still perform better in your sport anyways.
Yeah, and I know this isn't the topic of this webinar, but for those of you listening who still have that question about squats, it's okay provided that you do what Marty is talking about, and you're training a functional squat. You're training the squat in the movement pattern that leads to optimum movement that carries over to a bunch of other different things. So now that we have you back again, Wendy, let's. No, it's okay. It was. I think that happened to me last week, so it's going around. So let's talk about dynamic assessments, and why do we do them in a so-called corrective exercise course?
Well, keep in mind that dynamic assessments, they're an optional step for the refinement and confirmation of the observations made in the transitional and loaded movement assessments. So they can also be used with advanced clients who are preparing for sports training in order to make sure that they can maintain proper dynamic posture during high levels of intensity. So for examples,
So for example, a couple of the assessments that we suggest are the Davies test and also the depth jump or landing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Am I back?
Gate landing. You are back.
Yay!
You're back.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Oh my! I have no idea. Like seriously, but I think it's important to note that during these assessments, an emphasis on movement and speed and performance should all be encouraged during the dynamic movement from the client, because we're trying to get an idea of how the client's body is going to respond and react in a scenario that replicates what they
do at the speed of the sport in which they're performing. So
yeah. But I mean, basically our job as fitness professionals is we want to maintain a focus on movement quality and carefully look at all the movement impairments during the tests.
Sure.
So
by the end of this, we'll be able to finish each other's sentences.
Oh, well, thank goodness. Or we'd be here all day.
Right. So what are some of the dynamic assessments that you recommend, and how would trainer go about setting these up and performing them? Marty, why don't you go ahead and kick that off?
You and Wendy both did a couple of them, the jump test and then the landing test and then also the Davies, but also I've had people say, well, what if I can't have somebody jump off something? Well, you can even just speed up the overhead squat even slightly. Changing that speed, even if they don't ever leave the ground, will still maybe pick up a different movement compensation or exacerbate it. So the key thing is when you're doing the landing test, you're adding a big eccentric load. Now we'll preface it that even though it's corrective exercise, you're not dealing with an injured person, right? That's not the time if somebody's injured that you would have them do that eccentric load. This is for somebody who is, completely healthy, but might be ready to go participate in a sport. So you want to see what happens when you really add that acceleration and then that rapid deceleration, because that we know is when more injuries are likely to occur. So the key thing is, if you're dealing with someone who's had issues in a joint before, this is where Wendy said this is optional. But if you want to see something slightly different, just have maybe squat at a little bit quicker pace and see if there's a change. Because in everyday life, we are going to change speeds. So, they're phenomenal. But again, you got to use them when just like we said with the bench press test, there would be a point in time for that, but it has to be the right point in time to add anything that is that dynamic.
So let's pick up on that for both of you. Now, I'm preface this with a little history. I'm a Chicago Bulls fan, and there was a player on the Bulls who should remain unnamed who just couldn't get healthy, broke my heart a couple of times. So this player comes out of rehab and comes to you, Marty or Wendy, and you take him through after he's been cleared by the docs through our assessment and training process. At what time along that cycle would you implement these your dynamic assessments to let him know that he's really ready to play at that speed again and not injure himself going in for a layup?
Yeah. In that scenario, if you're being handed somebody after that process, they're ready to go because, corrective exercise and in the fitness industry, they would have had medical clearance. So at that point, you should be ready to go immediately, or they shouldn't be moved over from injury into fitness. So I would do it immediately. If I'm dealing with somebody that when I, being an athletic trainer, there's certain protocols that have to be met before you do that. But from a fitness standpoint, the key thing is if they have any pain or dysfunction, and when we say pain, not pain as an injury, but like, when I squat, I feel it a little bit, nothing that is an injury. Well, you don't need to add the dynamic at that point, right? Because if they're feeling stiff or they're a little limited in their overhead squat, you wouldn't want to add any speed or velocity to it. Mm-hmm. So again, that's not the time. So you're going to weigh that out as if even if they have movement dysfunction and you're going to do it in a controlled manner and they didn't have any type of discomfort from the overhead squat, then it's safe. But again, progressions, right? You don't have to jump off a 24-inch box. It can be off a 2-inch to a 4-inch, and you can control the amount of depth that you're letting them decelerate.
Okay, perfect. So now that we're talking about assessments, I want to pick back up and ask you a question, Marty, regarding transitional assessments. Do you have any, when we're looking at our movement segments, do you have any landmarks to let you know that that's the compensation that you're looking at? Like knees moving in, back arch, arms falling forward, that sort of thing. What are your landmarks that you use?
I'll stick to the 5 kinetic chain checkpoints, right? We're going to look at, the foot and ankle. We're going to look at, the knee, lumbopelvic hip complex, the spine, and then the arm, shoulder, and then all head and neck, right? If we see that forward head position. So, there's certain things you can pick up from each angle of the assessment. In the book, we do a great job of showing, hey, anterior view, look for this. On the lateral view, look for this. On the posterior view, for this. Just like I said before, as your eye gets sharper and sharper and you know what you're looking for, you'll be able to see some different things from different sides. One of the things that I like to see from the lateral view is you'll see if there's a difference in their ability to get their arms overhead. From the anterior view, you may not see that. But when you go lateral, hey, you know what? The right arm's more forward than the left arm. These things will all kind of add bits and pieces of information because, we teach it in a very systematic process. But generally speaking, if you dig enough as you get better with it and more comfortable, I should say, you're going to find some differentiation right versus left. Sometimes it's obvious and sometimes it's minor because, again, I'm right-handed. I played sports right-handed, so I have great external rotation in my right arm. My left arm is limited. And I sleep on my left side. I sleep in this position. I know my story and I know where my differentiations are right versus left. And I work on them so there's no major issues in my spine. But it's, it's a process. But, you're just going to look at those 5 kinetic chain checkpoints. But again, I'll go back to the exercises. When I'm going through my program, I'm still watching those 5 kinetic chain checkpoints because those are the telltale signs on where something's going to go wrong. And when I say wrong, it's not an injury. It's just a lack of form and control and technique issues that we have to correct.
Okay. And so just so that we're clear with our audience, when you say 5 kinetic chain checkpoints and you set them up for the squat and you have them do their repetitions, are you looking for any deviation? Mm-hmm. Any deviation for their starts from their starting point, or does that occur on a range?
It can occur from the static, right? So, I gave an example where as I get somebody started, I'll make sure their feet are pointed straight ahead, just as that standardization we talked about.
Sure.
And inevitably, when I watched them walk in, their feet turned out. But again, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. But inevitably, by the time I say, okay, now get your arms above your head, I look back down at their feet and they've already walked their feet back out, not even knowing, because that is their norm. That's where they feel comfortable. So our body memorizes movement patterns that we're familiar with. And going off on a weird change, I saw something one time that if you go in the shower and you use your soap, it's almost within one or two or within a few seconds, even though you've never thought about your pattern, it's the same pattern every single time you use the soap in the shower. So think about if you've been standing like that for 25 years, you're going to start creeping your feet back out where they were.
Sure.
So those are the standardizations that we look for, any deviation from that ideal position, and then we check those and then just watch it through the rest of the assessments as well.
Okay.
And to add to that, Prentiss, I mean, maybe it's just how you said the question, but just wanted to be clear to Marty's point. I mean, yes, we want to set them up in the ideal 5 kinetic chain checkpoints, and then we want to see how they move accordingly. So again, we mark the deviations that we see on the sheet. But then when we set them up to do the workouts, again, we want to set them up in the 5 kinetic chain checkpoints. And if they start to deviate, then we correct it. So again, what we're doing in the assessment, we want to find the information and design a program to hopefully start to work on those, corrections. But we still need to start teaching their brain and their body how to work together in that ideal 5 kinetic chain check alignment. So again, even if I do the transitional and I may do a couple, dynamic or mobility assessments, if I'm doing a chest press, that's still a push assessment. But I will put them in the 5Ks. If they are doing a row, it's a pull assessment. So again, we're doing a lot of different assessments. It's just at that point, we would want to correct them to.
Yeah. So let's, we lost Wendy. Wendy will be back with us soon. You're back, but Marty, let's finish up our assessments and then we're going to go to a question. Can you tell us about why is it important to use isolated mobility tests?
The beauty behind that is as you get more and more comfortable with human movement, it really starts to hone in on more of a specific technique that you can use to have your client get better results. Because when you're watching the overhead squat assessment, it gives you great information. But as we all know, there's multiple hip flexors. So if I see an arch in the low back, is it the psoas? Is it the rectus femoris? I mean, there's a couple things that you can see in movement assessments that can kind of hone you in. But those individual mobility assessments really now start to separate. So again, someone's like, I stretch my hip flexors all the time and I'm not seeing better results. Well, we got to talk about if they're doing the other parts of the continuum, right? But what if they're stretching the wrong hip flexor? So for example, I'll use myself as an example. On my right side, my psoas is tighter. On my left side, it's my rectus femoris. So I purposely have a program where I'll spend more time stretching my rectus femoris on my left side and more psoas on my right. I could just go, my hip flexors are tight. But I'm trying to hone in more specifically so that way I can make the best change possible. So that's why those individual mobility assessments just really kind of give you that final answer on what you saw in your movement assessments.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that is one question that we get a lot. And that is exactly what those isolated mobility tests are for. It just helps you hone in. So the goal of CES is to create targeted stretching and strengthening. So that mobility test is going to help you hone into the exact muscle group that you need to be working on at every level of your program, which leads us to a question from Melanie. Melanie, thank you for joining us today. And Melanie says, there are so many choices for assessments. How many is ideal to get a good picture for a general fitness client? And how do you plan them so that you don't spend a whole session of boring assessments from the client's perspective? Let's go with you, Wendy.
I can try it and see it until I cut out, I guess. You know what? I don't think that we need to think about the client thinking that it's boring, because again, this assessment in that hour or however long it takes is about them. And the more information you can gather to help identify what type of program they need, I think is the assessments that you should do. I mean, again, the PAR-Q, definitely important, signing waivers, definitely important. To me, I always do the overhead squat. If I have safe results with that, the single leg squat, again, might do the modified squat, but then I do goniometric assessments or the new mobility assessment.
So I'm going to pick up for Wendy and Melanie. You're going to do whatever you need to do to get the information that you need. So if you notice that your client has a compensation or an impairment with the overhead squat, and you're not quite sure what you want to focus on, you may add one or two isolated mobility tests just so that you can confirm everything that you're seeing. So you shouldn't be doing a ton of assessments. And then as a trainer, you're still in the business of, the client is there for a workout, and you're in the business of keeping that client happy. So when you frame your assessments, it's a warm-up. I just want to see what we need to do for movement prep today. So we're going to do this so that I can get a picture, and then we're going to start our workout. At no point during that workout should your client hear anything. Well, your feet are turning out. This is due to a lack of dorsiflexion, so we have to do some myofascial technique to stimulate your muscle spindles. No, you should never talk to anyone like that in general, but especially your clients. So frame it in something, in language that your client can understand. We're here. I want to get the best possible warm up for you, and so that you can get to your goals. Period. Dot. And you do all of that other stuff on your own time when you're filling out your records. And any corrections from my panel?
No, I think too that the dynamic assessments are super fun. I don't think anybody would think these tests isn't fun, or if the shark skill test is done, I think that's fun. The depth jump can be fun. So I don't want people to think that these are always boring, because again, they're having a good time hopefully with you, and they're just enjoying spending the time. Again, these clients end up becoming family if you have them long enough. So you might as well build the rapport from the start.
Yeah, and totally all about rapport building, and just start to speak your client's language. And we have another question here from oh boy, I will give this one to you, Marty. This may be a little out of scope for what we want to do with this course, but Karina asks, how do we prevent sports hernia with clients who lift heavy?
That's a great question, because really, going back to where this model came from, it was designed by Dr. Mike Clark when he was at North Carolina working with elite athletes. And there's a reason why he had corrective, and there's a reason why he had stabilization training. I'm not going to say we can prevent every injury, but when you look at what causes sports hernias, we know there's a weakness in the abdominal wall, and there could be problems with their form and technique on when they're lifting these heavy weights, or maybe they're lifting, too long a period of time, they're not undulating their program. So if I was going to say how you're going to prevent it, is follow the model. Make sure they have the right amount of joint motion in the corrective phase. And the reason why we want that is if they're moving well, we know they're going to handle load better as they move to their strength workouts. And if they have the deep intrinsic core stabilizers, when they do appropriately go to pick up that load, now they have their own internal weight belt keeping everything in place, that intervertebral stabilization. I did some research years ago about the weightlifting belts because I was competing in powerlifting. And the research they found is when you don't know how to stabilize and you use the weightlifting belt, you actually push into the belt, which is the complete opposite of drawing in. So I'm not going to say that I can guarantee it, but if you look at the model, all of these things are built in for that gradual increase in load, but it's got to be based on proper human movement. So, those are the main reasons. Obviously, there could be a few small percentage that maybe have something done from birth that have other issues. But by and large, I've been around enough people that had those type of injuries, didn't undulate their program, had a horrible range of motion throughout their lower extremity, couldn't fire their core the way we define it to save their life, and they end up with a sports hernia.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely brilliant, Marty. So what that turns into, and what Marty's saying there, is that yes, it was brilliant, Wendy.
She doesn't want to give me any credit, let's be honest.
Dude, we're trying to keep his head within the screen.
You take that facial expression back.
Exactly.
but it really boils down to, at somewhere along your training process, you missed a step.
Mm-hmm.
You missed a step. You rushed. You blew by something that was important, and just you sacrificed that to lift heavy. And you need to spend a little bit more time undulating that training. So this question is for, we have another question, and I think we've talked about most of our frequently asked questions, but Wendy, why was manual muscle testing and goniometry taken out of our course?
Well, mainly because they're very specialized, and so.
And
I'll pick up.
Yes.
Oh my.
Marty will pick up.
So they're very specialized, and to understand fully that range of motion and the bony landmarks takes some additional training. I encourage you all to do it. It's a great way to do it. However, there are some what we'll call eyeball tests that are very easy to do. So going back to the original question, like how long should I take and how can I get through this process efficiently for my clients potentially? So that's where, we're always looking for the best information from NASM. I still use goniometric measurement. I know Wendy does. So we're not saying not to use it. But then also when you start to look at manual muscle testing, again, unless you have learned how to do what we call touch license, hands-on, there's different levels of pressure, different fulcrum positions you need to focus on. So we just try to simplify it for the fitness industry and give phenomenal results. So I really love the new content. If you still want to break out the goniometer, if you've been trained on it, great. But here now, what we found was a lot of people were skipping that process because they just didn't feel comfortable enough. So we really met them where they're at to make it easier to find those amazing results when you can hone in and, like I said, separate, is it a quadricep, rectus femoris versus a hip flexor, et cetera.
And just to be clear too, I think all of us have had some post-grad education doing some form of manual therapy. And if my recollection serves me, and that was a long time ago, that was about between 20 and 30 hours of labs just for developing those skills for those types of tests. And we couldn't reasonably do it in a way that would serve the trainer in a few pages in a course. And that would require a course unto itself so that you can be proficient in it and get the information that you need from those skills. So I will ask this to both of you. How often do you reassess? And when do you reassess, and do you perform the same assessments each time? Wendy, let's start with you.
Well, basically with me, every time a client comes in, I reassess them by asking them how they feel, watching them walk in. And then, of course, I do some mobility tests. So I use the goni every time they're on my table. However, if I'm doing a formal reassessment, it would be approximately every 4 weeks to see if those results that I had taken from the overhead squat, the single leg squat, or any of the assessments I started with, to see if those that information that I gathered from day one, if I'm starting to see positive results in my programming. Again, the reason we reassess is to make sure that we're on point to try to get that client to a specific goal and to fix any compensations we may have noted when they came in. And then again, if we don't see any change, or we see it actually, get worse in certain areas, then it's a programming, it has maybe something to do with my programming, or something that the client might be doing at home that I'm not aware of, or if they're not doing their homework, their own foam rolling and stretching and certain things like that. So to answer your question, I always reassess daily, again, during movements and questioning, but then the formal is usually 4 to 6 weeks, because as we've learned throughout our textbook, it takes the body approximately that long to adapt start to adapt to whatever situation and demand we're placing on it. So we want to make sure we're giving ourselves adequate time to see a positive result.
I'm glad that you brought up that was brilliant too, Wendy.
Thanks, Prentiss.
But I'm glad that you did bring up programming, because oftentimes I run into trainers who spend the majority of their sessions just foam rolling, static stretching, and doing very limited exercise, which is why their clients came to them in the first place. And my assertion's always been that you missed a step in programming somewhere, because if you haven't seen, if they've come to you and they're healthy, relatively healthy, and you're still working on that same piece for, let's say, 6 months, it's either out of your scope or you miss something in your programming. Can either one of you talk about that? Let's start with you, Mark.
Sure. So one of the things is, are they doing their homework?
Yeah.
Fitness to me, and I know we're all fitness enthusiasts, but I'm honest with my clients when I was back in my training days, is it's a 7-day-a-week process. What I mean by that is, doesn't mean you have to be in the gym 7 days a week. Doesn't mean you have to train hard 7 days a week. But I'd really like you to pay attention to your posture 7 days a week. Whether it's changing your footwear, whether it's doing some stretching in the morning, or whether you come home from work when you've been sitting all day, even if that's not your day to exercise, you still maybe spend 10 minutes and loosen up your hips and foam roll. If we leave that just to the 10 minutes before the workout session, 2-3 times a week, probably not going to get everything done. As I've said before, no one sleeps in good posture that I've ever met. So we're getting 8 hours a day, probably a bad posture there. So again, I don't try to dump on them all at once the first time I meet them. We have this rapport where over a couple of weeks, I can sprinkle in some ideas as I get to know them and they give me feedback. And I can say, well, what about 5 minutes if you put this in here or do this there? And it becomes slowly, they build this habit of being aware of their body every day. And, on some of the coffee talks, people have asked the question, because I'm in the house a lot and I'm sitting in front of a computer, every single time I'm on a phone call that allows it, I'm out walking. Because, again, it gets me upright and I'm focusing on my gait and my hips. Now, again, we have the advantage of knowing these biomechanical things. But you'd be surprised how much your clients over a period of time that's digestible, they're going to appreciate these little tips. Walking the stairs. I purposely park farther away in parking lots. All these things that we process through our brain ends up giving them better results, because now there's more quantity in it. And then again, now we can spend more time in the gym on not fixing their posture the whole time, because they're doing it for us the whole time, getting them to sit in a chair better, getting them to focus on, is your computer right in front of you or is it shifted to one side? All of these things make a huge difference on what we dump into our body, so we get better results. And then we can, like you said, Prentiss, get them in there and exercise them.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that point ties into the questions from Melanie and Karina. First of all, you don't dump everything on them. They have enough going on. They have work. They have their family situations. We're the fitness experts, so we have to help them manage that a little bit and actually give them something that they are going to do. For me, when I've worked with people, if they could do one thing and just do that one thing, foam roll your calves and stretch your calves out, just do that for me every day for the next 3 weeks. And if they tell me that they can do that, if they've told me that they've done that consistently, then I add something else it takes a long time, but you don't want to overwhelm. your clients with too much extra work, because that's a recipe to not doing it at all. It's they're going to freeze up and not do it. So right now, let's just ask people who are listening if you have any questions. Are there any other questions from the audience? Okay, so we're at the end. I want to thank Wendy and Marty for that information. You were still here. Wendy. You still contributed.
We're in spirit, so.
Yeah, you're here.
I'm sorry,
and
y'all.
Trust me, you go back and listen to it. I swear I completed your sentences.
Thank you.
And Marty did as well. But let's start with you, Wendy. Do you have any takeaways regarding assessments and
I think my big takeaway is basically you should perform all assessments with every client. So therefore you have the blueprint on designing a program that's going to be beneficial towards their goals. Again, don't overthink it. Find the ones that fit their goals. Again, if they have no desire to be a high performance athlete, you know, the dynamic assessments may not be appropriate. If they have knee valgus, that's very, very, very apparent when doing the overhead squat. Probably the single leg squat's not most ideal. So just be smart in your assessment choices, and then again, make it fun for the client. And don't tell them all what everything means. You take that information, say, okay, I've got some great information that's going to help me design a fantastic program to get you towards your goals. This is what I want you to do at home the next few days until we meet again. Just give them a couple things. And again, what I usually tell them is make sure they have a foam roller, and I want them to bring it in the next time they come in, because some people don't own one. So that's their homework, is to purchase one or take a picture of it at home if they don't want to bring it in. And then, and then the next time they come in, I'll keep showing them things that I want them to do. So I think we kind of get in our heads, like, don't overwhelm the client. And then the other thing I tell them to do is, all I want you to do until I see you again is keep an eye out on your toes. And every time you see them turned out, I want you to point them forward. Even at the grocery store, look down when you're pushing a cart. If you see them going out, bring them in. And so they will come back and tell me, oh my goodness, I didn't realize how much I noticed that I have my feet out, or I turn a hip or hike a hip. And it's just making them aware of easy things that they can do without overwhelming them at once.
Thank you, Wendy. And how do people find you? How do they ask you questions after this is done?
Right. So my Twitter is WendyBats13. My Instagram is Wendy.bats13. And my email is wendy.bats@nasm.org.
Thank you. And for those of you listening, it has to be your own foam roller. It can't be a foam roller at your uncle's house. So you have to actually go out and purchase it and bring it into your own residence. Marty, what are your takeaways from today?
Everything Wendy said. So again, I go back to, I have what I call my 3 rules. I guess I've been around NASM and Mike Clark so long that everything has to be bullet points. So one, because I have a medical background, it's called do no harm, or just keep it safe, right? So we pick and choose what we're going to do from an assessment exercise based on what their needs are, and then we can add to it. Then it's give them what they want while you give them what they need, meaning that I'm in charge of their program. I'm going to listen to them. I'm going to make sure that they're involved in it so that way they stay engaged. But at the end of the day, I know I have to follow the model because they may not know what they need. And then absolutely number 3 is keep it and make it fun, right? Because there's a lot of stuff going on in my head, but like you said, Prentiss, it doesn't mean it comes out that way. It's just little cues and little things, and then adding, again, that little bit of layer over a course of time, and you'll be stunned how much more compliant they are, especially if you're building them up to their successes they've already had. And, just say, man, you foam rolled that one muscle 7 days in a row. Yeah, you and I want more. But again, it's a process, So getting them just to take responsibility for their own health. And that's, again, it's a step by step. And you'd be stunned over the course of a couple months how much change you can make in people.
Outstanding. And same for you, Marty. How can people find you after this is all done?
Yes, it's miller.marty72 is my Instagram. And then email is marty.miller@nasm.org.
Okay. So thanks everyone for who stayed on with us for the entire hour. Thank you, and get out there and start assessing, and have a great afternoon.
Excellent.
Bye.